What's up guys, my name is Marc Steiner, and today we're talking about the device that my livelihood depends on, the Sony A7R III. Now this thing is a beast. I've had it for a little over a year now, and I've put it through its paces. I've done everything you could possibly do to this, and it's performed so well, and I absolutely love this camera. Now this camera might look small right out of the box, but don't let that fool you. This thing has 10 frames a second, this thing has 15 stops of dynamic range, this thing has log, 4K, 120, what else would you want in a camera? One of the biggest issues with Sony cameras prior to this model was battery life, and that was a huge deal breaker for a lot of professional photographers. Because of that, the A7R II was more of a niche product, more for studio shoots, because it was more akin to a medium format camera, but the battery life sucked, so you couldn't really take it out in the world without bringing 8 batteries with you. I've shot 2 complete weddings on this setup. That means 8 to 12 hour weddings where I took thousands of photos and a lot of video, and only depleted 1 to 1.5 batteries during that session. That's insane. I didn't even deplete 2 batteries while shooting for that long, taking 3,000 images and 30 gigabytes worth of slow motion. The EVF on this thing is nothing short of incredible. It's so amazing being able to see the image before you even take it. You know what the final image is going to look like before you even push the shutter. That's something unheard of. And because of that, I never find that I need to review files. I'm never chimping. I know that I got the shot. The autofocus is lightning fast on this camera, but as a portrait photographer, I usually use eye autofocus, and since my subjects aren't doing crazy movement, they track more than just fine. My hit rate is very high using eye autofocus, and this technology, still Sony is the clear winner because no other company has nailed eye autofocus like that. And with an update coming later this year for the A9, A7R III, and A7 III, the eye autofocus is going to get even better. So instead of having a 70% hit rate with a moving subject, you're going to be getting close to 100% hit rate on a moving subject. Now that is unheard of. So eye autofocus is absolutely incredible, and it's only going to get better. This camera is focus peaking and punches in when you're focusing manually, which is super helpful in achieving critical focus for both video and photo. Now, the real reason why a lot of people buy this camera is because of the megapixel count. This thing is 42 megapixels. That's a whopping amount. The biggest downside for me about this sensor is that it's actually the same sensor from the A7R II, which was kind of a bummer for me when I first got this camera because I was so hyped and I was like, they didn't change the sensor. But because of processing power, they're able to pull a lot more information out of the sensor, and it works amazingly. There's no complaints here whatsoever. It's actually very common where cameras cannot take full advantage of the sensor inside of them because of how much processing power it would take to do that. Is 42 megapixels too many? For most, probably. For me, I probably don't need it either, but I do appreciate it. Having the ability to crop whatever way I want is so helpful, and it's saved my butt a couple of times when I'm able to crop in with that resolution. And it lets me get really creative with certain photos that I couldn't otherwise get if I had a lower resolution camera. This sensor also does not have an AA filter, which means your photos are going to be even sharper compared to cameras that do have an AA filter. This camera is technically a touchscreen camera, but I wouldn't use it that way because it's not efficient. Like, they haven't mastered it like Canon has. So even though it is technically touchscreen, I would not use it as a functioning touchscreen because it's much easier to just use the thumbstick. Hopefully that's something that Sony will fix in the next generation of cameras. Speaking of the screen does come out and articulate, so you can flip it up and flip it down, which is helpful for when you're shooting up or shooting low, but it does not flip out to the side or fully up, so you can't take selfies with this screen, which is kind of a bummer. The thumbstick is very helpful for selecting your autofocus points, and it's a lovely feature to have, but again, since I'm using mostly eye autofocus, I don't use it that often, and with the update coming later this year, I might not ever need to touch the thumbstick again. Every single button on this camera is customizable, and that's something that I love about Sony. That's something that no other camera company is doing. They're starting to do it more in their mirrorless cameras where you can customize certain buttons, but I'm saying like literally every single button is customizable on this thing, and it's absolutely insane. People used to complain about the Sony menu systems, how they were so long and you couldn't find anything. And to some extent, I still agree with that. They are long and they could be organized better. However, the reason why those menu systems are so long is because there's so much customizability that you can do to this camera. So once you initially get in the menu systems, it might seem daunting, but as you go through them and set up the camera how you personally like to shoot, then you never need to go into them ever again, and your camera is amazing. The customizability of this camera was something that I absolutely loved. It allowed me to put any button where I wanted it to be for what I like to do, And I found myself in certain situations wishing, I was like, man, I wish this button did this. And I was like, wait, I can just map it to do that. And so next time I didn't have that problem. The My Menu page, also very helpful for the things that you can't map to a specific button. You can just put it on a menu page that you use the most and have the most important features there for you. This camera does have dual SD card slots, so you can write simultaneously. However, only one of those slots is UHS 2. Which means the other one is really going to slow you down if you're writing simultaneously. If you're only shooting to one card slot, I highly recommend you shoot to card slot number 1 because that is the faster card slot. And if your SD card gets full, switch out the cards between the slots so you still get to take advantage of that faster speed. Weather sealing on this camera is fine. I used to baby my camera a lot because I was worried about how weather sealed it actually was. But as I saw other people putting it through a lot more than I ever would, and it survived, I got less worried, but I know it still doesn't hold up to something like the 1DX Mark II or the D5. Low light performance on this camera is adequate considering its high megapixel count. With higher megapixels, you are getting worse low light performance, but considering the dynamic range, it is very good. You are going to be introducing a lot more noise than the A7 III, a much lower resolution camera. And striping does occur when you are severely underexposing things and bringing it up in post, which is rather unfortunate. However, if you're exposing correctly and not bringing back shadows completely beyond compare in post, your photo is going to be fine. This is a mirrorless camera, so you can shoot completely silently. Fun fact, the royal wedding was shot exclusively on the Sony A9 because of that, and I thought that was super cool. However, the A9 and the A7R III do have different sensors, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Being able to shoot silently comes in very handy in certain situations. I remember I was shooting a wedding, and the family was saying a prayer before the wedding, and I didn't want the loud clack clack of a camera going off and disturbing this beautiful moment, so I turned on silent mode and got all these amazing photos, and no one even knew I was taking photos, so I was very happy with that. However, when you are shooting silently, the subject needs to be relatively still because any movement is going to be distorted a little bit because there's still a significant amount of rolling shutter when shooting silently. Things that should look spherical when they're moving suddenly look oval, and it's a little off. I'd also not recommend silent shooting mode for low light photography because, again, you're going to get massive banding, and that's not what we want. Video quality on this camera is great. You're getting a full frame sensor, and you get to take full advantage of that, so you get that full benefit of a full frame sensor, unlike other cameras that still crop in. But that being said, you do have the ability to crop in if you so wish, which is super helpful for video because you get 2 focal lengths out of the same lens. One of the shortcomings of the video on this camera is the bitrate. It maxes out at 100 megabytes per second for every category of video, which is kind of unfortunate. It's also only shooting 8-bit color, so not a huge deal if you're only uploading to YouTube, but if you're trying to do some crazy color grades, it's not gonna hold up the same. I would appreciate 10-bit in the future, but 8-bit is very respectable, and when you're uploading to YouTube, no one's really gonna be able to tell. This camera does ship with a bunch of picture profiles, which is super helpful for video, and included in those picture profiles is log. You get S-Log2 and S-Log3, which is great. I would highly recommend not using S-Log3 because it cannot hold up because of the things we just talked about, 8-bit color and the lower bit rate. But S-Log2, very respectable, you can grade it very well, and it's not going to fall apart. My favorite picture profile right now is HLG, and I highly recommend this one. I'm going to be doing a whole separate video on that. In-body image stabilization is great on this camera. This means that it's stabilized for every single lens. Sure, it's not going to be as good as specific lens stabilization, but the fact that it works across every single lens as well as adapted lenses, that's just insane. This comes in handy for video and photo because you get less shaky footage when doing video, and you have the ability to do handheld long exposures. Because of the IBIS, you also have the ability to do pixel shift on this camera. I have not taken advantage of this, but what it does is it moves the sensor 1 pixel at a time and then merges these 4 images that it took in post for a much higher resolution photo, which looks great, and I think this is super helpful for architecture photography. If you're doing something like portraits or any moving subject, it's not going to go well because nothing can be that still while the sensor is moving. File size is massive because of the resolution on this camera. Uncompressed file size is about 80 megabytes per photo. That's absolutely insane. So I shoot compressed, which is 40 megabytes per photo, which is still a lot. So if you shoot compressed, you're getting double the amount of storage on your SD cards, you're saving space on your hard drive, and you're speeding up your workflow in Lightroom and Photoshop because it's a less large file and it can handle it better. The difference between uncompressed and compressed is very minimal. You only see a little bit of difference in the detail and the shadows at the edges, and I think that the trade-off for half the space is a huge win over a little bit of detail in the shadows. The top dial in this camera has a button that you have to push, so suddenly this thing that should only take 2 fingers takes 3 fingers, and it does kind of irk me. This doesn't show up on the A7 III, and I wish that the A7R III didn't have this button either. When you're switching from photo to video mode, it doesn't save your previous settings, which is kind of a pain. So if I was taking photos at 1/8000 and then I want to switch over to video, throw an ND filter on, it now is still 1/8000. It didn't save 1/50 or 1/125 or 1/250 from the last time I was shooting video. I have to change the picture profile manually. I do wish that it would save those settings, so when I'm switching from photo to video, it's just a very quick process. I don't have to change all my settings for video when I switch back, and vice versa for photo and video. I just wish that it saved those settings. This camera is a small camera, and this comes in handy in certain situations. When you're maybe in a place that doesn't really accept photos and you have this small body, people are willing to look the other way because they're like, oh, that isn't a really professional camera, it's fine, he's not getting great photos. Little do they know you have one of the best cameras on the market and some of the best image quality on planet Earth in your hand. That's incredible. However, with a small body means that your hand is not going to cover the entirety of the body, and a lot of people, including myself, complain about the pinky space of this camera, which is one of the reasons why I bought the battery grip. Color science is much improved compared to the previous generation, and I really like this. Skin tones are much more natural. You're getting a much better image because of these colors. In my personal opinion, I think that Sony colors right out of the camera are much more earthy. They're much more green, brown, yellow, and that's for certain photographers, that's great. But I feel like I like more Canon colors, like that red magenta, which I absolutely love. I will say also that the Sony photos and video highlight roll-off is not great. Highlights are super sharp, so if you're going for that pop and highlight when you're shooting a model, great. But if you want a more pleasant highlight roll-off, you're gonna have to do a little bit more work in post. But because of that dynamic range, it's still there, you're fine, it's just a little bit more work that you have to do. This is something for me that was kind of a big issue in video mode because you're not shooting raw video, you don't have complete control over this. Even in log profiles, when you were color grading, the highlights were still super harsh. No matter what I did to color grade it, just out of camera, highlights were always harsher on Sony compared to other camera brands, which is another reason why I switched to HLG, because there's a much more aggressive highlight roll-off and it looks much more pleasant to me. However, Sony recently hinted at in a future update possibly changing the highlight roll-off and making things look a little bit more natural and pleasing, so we might get that in the future. All in all, this camera is absolutely incredible, and in my opinion, not only is it still relevant, but it still beats out a lot of the competition in many ways. In my opinion, as usual, Sony is competing with itself, and the biggest competitor to this camera is the Sony A7 III. Alright guys, that's it from me. Let me know in the comment section down below, do you own an A7R III? Are you thinking about buying one in the coming year? Let me know. My name has been Marc Steiner, and I will see you next time.